So yesterday, UNEP Executive Director Inger Andersen reminded us that emissions must come down 7.5% annually for us to achieve 1.5. And for that, we do need ambition. So our next session focuses on just that. I'd like to invite on stage Remco Fischer to lead the next panel. And as the panelists take to the stage, let's talk about the commitments their organizations have made. Marc, Kahn from Investec Group, they are members of the Principles for Responsible Banking and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Maria Simonson from Swedish Export Credit Corporation, a founding member of the Net Zero Export Credit Agency. Masaaki Iwabuchi from Nippon Life Insurance Company, a member of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and a steering group member as well. And Reid from Global Optimism, advisor to Christiana Figueres and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. Remco, over to you.
Super. Thanks very much, Mustafa. And good to see, good morning to all of you. Good to see such a packed room of people here focused on the roles and needs of finance and the capital markets in keeping our planet livable. We want to discuss here today this really monumental task that we have all in front of us over the next years and decades, which is to get emissions down to net zero by 2050. And we need that so that we have a fighting chance of keeping the global temperature increase to 1.5 in the long term by 2100. And achieving this monumental task requires leadership from everyone, all of us, including certainly financial institutions, including certainly governments, and it also requires collaboration. So leadership, collaboration are here the key ingredients. We have a really good panel. Mustafa already introduced all of you and myself, so I don't have to do that anymore. I just want to mention that we have a very diverse panel, geographically speaking, and we have a very diverse panel also in terms of financial industry. So we have representation from Asia, from Europe, from Africa, from North America, and we have representation from different financial institutions, institutional investment, insurance, banking, civil society, export credit. We have all of them here on deck. So great diversity on a number of fronts. We have zero diversity, however, on one thing, which is climate ambition on this panel. Everyone on this panel is, and their organizations are committed, whether they're a financial institution or a civil society organization, are committed to net zero by 2050 in terms of their portfolio emissions going down to that and aligning their portfolios and their financing practice with 1.5. So great ambition on geography, great ambition, great diversity on geography, great diversity on financial industry, zero diversity on ambition, which is really great to see. Now let me frame a little bit the discussion. Why is this so important, 1.5? Why is that, what is that the key challenge that we face at the moment? It is that if we stay for too long, for too far above 1.5, what we will see is that we will cross planetary thresholds, points of no return, they're called, that will be irreversible and that will be truly disruptive to global civilization the way we know it today. I'm talking about things such as the Amazonian rainforest becoming a savanna in this century, and things like desertification in many places around the world increasing dramatically, things like sea level rise increasing dramatically, let alone kind of a massive intensification and an increase in the frequency of extreme weather events. So let me emphasize this again. The reason scientists tell us we do not want to be too far above 1.5 degrees for too long is that we want to avoid the crossing of those points of no return. Now, there's some people who are saying 1.5 is dead. It's unachievable at this point. It should no longer be a consideration. And let me respond to those people that they're wrong and that they're not getting the details in all of this right. They will say 1.5 is dead because we've already reached it in 2023 and 2024. We've had 12 months where we've had 1.5 of global warming already. But we've already had that in 2015 for a number of months, in 2016, and that is not failure on the 1.5 objective the way it's codified in the Paris Agreement, nor the way it is being calculated and put forward by the scientific community. Failure will be when, again, for too long and for too far above 1.5, when we stay for too long and for too far above 1.5, that we start crossing those thresholds and those points of no return. And we're not at that point yet. We're touching 1.5, and we will go beyond 1.5 in the years and decades to come. But again, that is not failure yet. We still, as long as we're not touching those thresholds, we can go back to 1.5 to make sure that in the second half of the century, and that's the objective, the way it's meant in the Paris Agreement and the way it's being put forward by the scientific community. Now, this is a monumental task, and the good thing about monumental tasks is they're really good for the economy. They're really good for growth and for the economy and for job creation. And we've seen that as societies time and again in times of war. Wars are terrible, but they tend to be good for the economies. And what we need now is a war on emissions. And that's an economic growth story, if anything else. For us to win that war, we need all hands on deck. I've mentioned consumers, producers, finance, investors, governments, etc. How are those hands on deck at the moment? It's a mixed bag. We have government, we have the Paris Agreement. Governments have committed to net zero by 2050. They've committed to striving for 1.5. The problem at the collective level, the problem that we see is that individually, national countries, as they submit their climate plans, are not really delivering on what they should be. So if you add up all the climate plans of countries, we don't get to 1.5, we at present get to 2.7. At the same time, from the private sector, we're seeing a lot of leadership, as I've mentioned. All of the organizations here are in either of the net zero alliances that we facilitate. And so now the challenge is really, how can we use the leadership in the finance sector that we have now 200 financial institutions only in the UNEP FI membership committed to 1.5, and they're setting targets. It's not like it's only lip service. They're setting short-term targets to that. How can we use that leadership to get the rest of the system to move ahead with them, including, first and foremost, governments and regulators? So that's what we're going to discuss today. And let me turn immediately to the panel. I've spoken already for too long. And I'll start with you, Sue. You've just come back from COP29 in Baku. Tell us a little bit about the vibes there when it comes to 1.5, to where does that stand politically, financially, economically at the moment?
Thanks. Is this on? Yes. Thanks so much, Remco. And I think, as usual, you sort of dropped the mic on the question of whether or not, the proverbial question of whether or not 1.5C is still alive, and emphatically agree, and I guess this echoes the lack of diversity on 1.5C ambition, emphatically agree that it's a moral, equitable, political and economic imperative, not just a monumental task, but an imperative for ongoing and stepped up, more urgent action to align with 1.5C. There is still this window of opportunity to keep overshoot of 1.5C within manageable levels so that we achieve the Paris Agreement ambition to limit global temperature rise to no more than 1.5C through 2100. And we're seeing some painful, increasingly painful dialogues. COP29 was pretty ugly in Baku, and we saw illuminated perhaps more crisply than ever before the really stark, dire needs of developing countries that contributed so little to the drivers of climate change, and yet increasingly are in states of debt distress or on the cusp of debt distress, on the front lines of facing the impacts of climate change, and this really gaping chasm between their resource needs, estimated by the Stern-Songway report at roughly $1.3 trillion a year through 2035, and what developed countries are contributing to close that gap. So in Baku, we saw reinforcement of 1.5C. We didn't see any jettisoning of 1.5C as the global target for effectively addressing the climate crisis. But we only saw incremental steps in terms of the actual commitments and actions of developed countries. So that included finalizing the playbook for carbon markets. It included setting what's known as the new collective quantified goal. Of course, there's an acronym for that, NCQG, for developed countries to reach $300 billion a year of mobilized finance by 2035 to meet these needs of developing countries just for climate-related needs, right? So mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And that's a big gap between $300 billion committed and $1.3 trillion that's recognized in the actual COP decision as what's needed, even before you consider that, to the order of $300 billion a year through 2030, 2035, is in the nature of investment needed in adaptation and resilience, for which private finance doesn't typically lend itself particularly well. You really need grant-based, highly concessional resources for that piece of the equation. And then we have all the way out to the 1.3 trillion. So it really is, as Remco has said, an all-hands-on-deck situation. We have the groundwork laid with a mandate to create the Baku to Belém, meaning COP29 to COP30 roadmap for how do we close that gap between the $300 billion and the $1.3 trillion a year, using a whole range of different tools, including real progress on international financial architecture reform, on recalibrating MDBs and national development banks for better mobilization of private capital, both internationally and domestic flows. Solidarity levies moving forward in terms of pricing carbon associated with shipping and other international commerce with goods. We have to really move forward, and the private finance sector, especially those leaders, including those who are on the panel here today, who have the credibility of having rolled up their sleeves and put their shoulders to the oar to actually take action and work to align with 1.5C, to reach out and continue to lean on governments to adopt ratcheted national commitments, the NDCs that are due early in 2025, to set the real economy policies that are aligned with the global stocktake outcomes that were agreed last year in Dubai, to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, accelerate phase out of fossil fuels, and halt and reverse deforestation. So it's all within reach, but we really, really collectively need to step up the action and urgency.
Thanks very much. So, and just to crystallize, I think, one or two of the things that you've said, I think for the finance sector coming out of Baku, the challenge and the opportunity is obviously still remain focused on the climate commitments that you've made. For that, you need to activate the stakeholders around you, your clients, especially your regulators and your governments, more so potentially than has happened in the past, but then also keep an eye on the specific challenges of developing countries and think through on how you can work with MDBs, with DFIs, with the governments in developing emerging economies to get the capital there, because we need even more capital there than we needed in the north. So thanks a lot for that, Sue. Let me turn to one of our first financial institutions on the panel, Masaaki, who's been a Nippon Life, representing Nippon Life, a member of the oldest Net Zero Alliance, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. Masaaki is a member of the steering group. Nippon Life is a member of the steering group. So could you tell us how are you concretely kind of taking that commitment forward towards your commitment and your targets?
Okay, thank you, Remco. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm Masaaki Iwabuchi, in charge of finance planning, including ESG and sustainability investments. So Nippon Life, we are one of the largest life insurance company in Japan, with about $600 billion asset under management. So it's not 1.3 trillion, but it's enough to fill in the gap. Nippon Life also is one of the steering group member of Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, representing Asian Pacific region. So what happens at Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance is all the Asset Alliance member, including Nippon Life, has made 6% greenhouse gas emission reduction in 5 years, which is in line with 1.5. But if you look at the real world economy, GHG emissions are still increasing. So why is that? The answer and the solution from Nippon Life perspective is a transition finance. Transition finance was the area where people used to avoid because it is not dark green, it is rather lighter green or greenish area. So some asset owners do not invest in these assets. They prefer greener one. However, with the reaching 1.5, people realize the importance of transition finance, which affects real-world decarbonization. So Nippon Life launched its own transition finance framework in May this year, and it's for how to abate sectors. So the idea is because transition finance always associated with uncertainty. So the idea is we encourage how to abate sector company to provide clear pathway of 2030, 2040, and 2050 respectively by entity level or asset level. So that's the transparency, and we encourage the company and toward net zero pathway. So that's the idea. And they sometimes may overshoot at the beginning of the pathway, but plan to reduce sharply in the end, meeting 1.5. So, and also I want to mention that the insurance policy holder supported this idea when we come up with the framework, which is good from the fiduciary duty point of view. We had conducted about 30,000 policyholders for the interview, and they prefer the balance of economic return and sustainability, not just pursuing the finance return. So they also, we disclose the framework for public and try to share the idea with peers so that they can follow the similar idea, encouraging companies toward 1.5. So, and also this is very important in Asian region. We must need transition finance. So transition finance for how to abate sector, transition finance for emerging economy, whatever. So it depends on the definition of the transition. Anyway, in conclusion, we never give up 1.5. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Masaaki. And I think you highlight the notion of transition finance. There's, by the way, another panel later today discussing exactly that everyone interested should attend. And I think from my perspective, transition finance has been a little bit the missing piece in the history to date of like climate action by financial institutions. We've always emphasized a lot engagement, shareholder engagement. We've always emphasized a lot the climate, the deep green climate solutions, and that more money has to go there. And those are part of the solution. But the other part of the solution is, of course, helping those industries that are transitionable to really transition. And that requires finance. That's an opportunity, I think, to financial institutions. And so it starts creating a bit of a win-win situation. Of course, we need to be mindful that not all industries are transitionable, but we'll get to that a little bit later in the discussion. Thanks very much, Masaaki. Let me turn to you, Marc. And of course, we've been discussing a lot about net zero and the environmental outcomes there, but that's not the only thing the financial institution has to manage, right? You need to be on your radar. You need to have risk, return, opportunity, all sorts of stakeholder expectations. How are you bringing all of that together, together with the net zero and the environmental agenda into kind of, a set of actions that actually are feasible for a financial institution like Investec?
Yeah, thank you. Hello?
You may have to turn it on.
There we go. Hello? Hello, hello? Yeah.
Hello? All right, so I think that what's important is to understand that there are real commercial strategies at the heart of this pathway. So by way of example, I'll give one of those that we're working with in our business in the United Kingdom in the real estate sector. So we have a substantial real estate book. Now, what we've seen in the UK is that the government has set energy performance certificate ratings for 2028 and for 2030, below which, if a piece of commercial real estate is not achieved that level of energy performance, the landlord will no longer be able to rent out that property. So immediately with this coming through in the United Kingdom, we looked at our real estate book, and from a risk point of view, this introduced risk. We've now got assets sitting there which suddenly, we would have clients that may not be in a position to service the debt on the mortgage they may have, or on whatever structure that may be in place. So from a risk point of view, that's suddenly perceived to be, from our risk modeling, a negative vector. However, what we've got to do, and this is what we have done in the UK and our businesses, we've come from our side in the strategy and sustainability side, said, hang on a second, this is actually a revenue writing opportunity. And we have to look at it in a very different way. How do we look at it? Well, firstly, what this brings about is immediate demand for infrastructure upgrades for those properties. So there is a funding requirement to support clients in improving the energy ratings of those buildings. And that, firstly, is revenue writing opportunity. But secondly, that revenue writing de-risks the book. Because to the extent that those assets are now at an energy rating above a B by a certain date and so forth, the asset is actually now more valuable, firstly, and that's the first thing. And it's easier to rent out because it has a lower cost in terms of the costs of the energy for the tenant. And for us, suddenly we've mitigated risk, commercial risk. But we've done all that in service to a decarbonization of the United Kingdom's real estate infrastructure. And so that is an example where you bring together, commercial strategy, which is profitable, with a decarbonization agenda. And at the same time, and I think you mentioned when we spoke earlier, is that you also don't have a scenario where beyond a certain date you'd have stranded assets on your book. So I give that example because I think that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in terms of bringing the commercial vector alongside the decarbonization vector. And we need more and more of those examples. And I'll conclude by saying one observation. Note, what triggered this opportunity? Government regulation. And we'll come back to that maybe later, but I don't think we can achieve 1.5 from the financial services side without the government coming in and producing the constraints for us to write business into that direction. And that is a major piece of limitation to what's possible for a bank.
Right. That's. I mean, when you first told me about this example, I was immediately fascinated. Again, because typically, when the government wants to put some new regulation in place to green anything, a lot of the private sector will say that's bad for business, right? You shouldn't be doing that at first sight. This is going to cost growth. This is going to cost opportunity. This is going to cost jobs. But actually, the example that you provided is the exact opposite. It's a government putting in place a green policy that all of a sudden creates growth, business, reduces the risk of the portfolio over time, increases the value of the portfolio over time. It gives you credit business, mortgage business, I assume. And at the same time, it's delivering on environmental objectives. And it's a win. I think it's not win-win-win. I think it's win-win-win-win-win. So 4 wins or 5 wins or something like that. And I think we need to see a lot more of that. And I think if we can get to a situation where actually the finance sector is asking for these things, because there's so many wins in there, including commercial wins for them, then we might make a lot of progress on this notion of all hands on deck. and going forward. So we'll come back to that example again to see how that might work in others. We shouldn't be doing only in real estate. We should be doing that across the whole, part of the economy, at least those parts of the economy that are transitionable towards net zero. Maria, let me turn to you now. You are a member of the latest Net Zero Alliance, the first Net Zero Alliance of public financial institutions, the export credit agencies. In a similar vein to what I asked Marc, you are a state-owned financial actor, of course, working with export finance. How do you manage the expectations that are on you, from your government, but also from your clients? There must be a lot of tension in there as you kind of, pursue your efforts, to align with 1.5.
Yes, thank you. So yes, just to put a bit of context into the sort of ecosystem that around export credit finance, we support the Swedish export industry. We can finance the exporters, the suppliers, but also the buyers of Swedish goods and services, which means that we have a lot of Swedish content going into global value chains. And the decarbonization and shift of those value chains create huge growth opportunities, of course, for Swedish exporters. And so when we look at our stakeholders, we, of course, have the one we are here to serve, these exporters. And Sweden is a small trade-dependent economy with over 50% of the GDP coming from export, large companies going into their products abroad, and so they're seeing a huge growth opportunities here, as you say, and we're there to support them. So we have been for some time now supporting with finance for their investments, where they see new value chains coming up, new systems being created, and on the same time navigating the risk, because of course there are risks in this transition in quite complex systems such as energy, transportation, food supply, etc., etc. And so as a bank, we very much function as a bank. We're government owned, we have a board, we're supervised by FSA. We must balance the opportunities to growth, but also the risk of the transition. So it's important that we also note those incentives that are coming out now into different industries and understand what that will drive. So it's not only going for the green, we also need to make sure that it's economically viable and sustainable and fit in a low carbon society. And so it's very much driven by the customer demands and needs. I would say also that our investors were funded in the capital markets. We have asset owners such as Masaaki's here, buying our bonds. They're also wanting to know how we address these risks in our lending. We then, of course, have the government. We have a clear steer there to be commercially driven, but also on sustainable terms. And the reason then the Net Zero ECA Alliance was formed with a handful of export credit agencies was that we saw a need to come together and try to work out methodologies for how to make methods robust, scientifically sort of based in order to be predictable, to ensure a level playing field so that we can help the companies we're there to support.
Thanks very much, Maria. Let me now, I think we want to turn now a little bit more, we started doing that already, but to this question of, there's a lot of leadership in the finance sector. Obviously, not all of the finance sector is leading, but we see, important parts of the finance sector doing that. But we now need to move the whole system. First question to you, Sue, would be around what are the most effective leverage points that you see, for the finance sector toward aligning with 1.5 pathway, or to get the economy and the actors around the financial institutions to all move in that direction?
Yeah, very good question, Remco. And I'd love to start with putting a finer point on something Masaaki said with regard to the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and its leadership. If you look at the most recent progress report, you see not just 6% emissions reductions across portfolios on average, but it's 6% per year, year on year on year. And that is true leadership. It's courageous leadership in that It really is pushing the envelope in terms of what's feasible at this moment in time with the existing policy enabling environment, even as it's what's economically sensible in navigating these escalating portfolio-specific and systemic climate-related risks. So that may seem anomalous to refer to courage in this context, but we're really seeing that with the Asset Owner Alliance. Now, that's not enough. The Asset Owner Alliance itself and the other alliances can't themselves alone solve this on a systemic basis, which is what's required. We really have to take it out across the real economy much more broadly. As Christiana Figueres, the founder of Global Optimism and former UNFCCC secretary, often has said, as goes finance, so go emissions. And I would offer a friendly amendment to that, that as goes policy and the policy environment, so goes finance and so go emissions. And there really is a massive role for financial institutions, especially those who have been exerting leadership, to lean on policymakers to really adopt at a national level the overarching objectives that have already been agreed by every country on earth on the global stocktake, on renewables, on efficiency, on accelerating phase out of fossil fuels, on halting and reversing deforestation. And I encourage you, we're short on time, and I'm sorry if you'll indulge me, but train your gaze even momentarily on the green parts, not just the fabulous panelists up here, present company excluded, but forests. And conservation of forests have such a crucial role in terms of 1.5C, net zero alignment. Deforestation is responsible for 11% annually of greenhouse gas emissions, and nature can supply up to 30% of greenhouse gas reduction solutions. And so stepping up in that area, which is very much embedded, it's nature, but it's also very much climate and net zero, stepping up in that area, stepping up on policy engagement on the enabling environment, and doing that with a truly holistic global lens, getting past the tragedy of the geographic horizon and really seeing that all of the world needs to transition to 1.5C and net zero for climate stability to be in reach for all of us is an imperative. And every single financial institution, no matter what flavor, no matter what genre, no matter what geography, you all have a role to play.
Thanks, Sue. And you're saying the finance sector and the economy need policies for 1.5 along the ways I've described it at the beginning to remain feasible, and it still is. Marc, you said the finance sector wants policies. It needs them, it wants them because they make sense commercially. So that's already kind of a gold nugget of insight that we're getting out of this session. Masaaki, turning to you, what's your take on the role of policymakers? Can you elaborate from an Asian perspective? What does a net zero committed AO, asset owner like Nippon Life, need from them, over the next 5 years, ideally?
Thank you, Remco. I think in terms of policy and regulation, I think EU goes first, and the Asian country has a bit lag, but they are following. So let's say we don't have CSRD regulation, but we have Sustainability Standard Board of Japan is developing the rule for the implementation in 2027. So likewise, there's a EU taxonomy here, but we didn't have that. But now we have ASEAN taxonomy. So we are following, so that's the number one. And I think in that context, I think maybe we may ask regulators to do as soon as possible. So that is the one way. But I think the good idea for Asian market is carbon pricing mechanism. So Japan, we recently established its own ETS, emission trading system. And it's still early stage, but combining with the regulatory carbon market, we call the J-credit or JCM, and with the intention of the international credit using Article 6 of Paris Agreement. So I think the carbon pricing is the tool for the impact for decarbonization directory. So I think this is the important one to follow that. So Nippon Life is very keen on that. So we had a lot of discussion with governmental bodies such as Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and the Ministry of Environment. That's the things. But however, one thing I would mention is you have to be careful about regulation. Regulation is a very strong, like a strong medicine, so they sometimes has a side effect, deteriorating the market without intention. So I think the balance is very important. Right. So that's it from me.
Thanks, Masaaki. I think on that analogy of medicine with side effects, one of the things the AOA did when it was talking about carbon pricing is actually to put everything, in that paper to say, this is very needed, can be very effective. I mean, economists have been telling us for years, if not decades. But there is design implications, design options, and you need to make the right ones to avoid some of those side effects. Marc, are financial institutions, from your perspective, doing enough to get the policies they need for 1.5?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a slightly controversial answer to that. Are we doing enough? And perhaps turn it on its head. I mean, let's take, for example, example I gave earlier. When we have a policy, for example, in the United Kingdom, that allows us to write very commercially lucrative business into a sustainable vector, such as infrastructure upgrades for energy performance of commercial buildings. When we have such a policy, then the natural economic machine kicks in, and you will find that banks will be funding very, very firmly into that particular trajectory. Now, when we don't have those policies in place, asking banks to lead the way, and I know this is a controversial statement, is problematic. Why? Because at the end of the day, most of us are listed entities. We attract or repel capital flows into our stock based on our performance measures, whether they're return on equity or cost to income, but they're going to be profit and loss related. And unfortunately, it is not true to say that all sustainable plays are necessarily profitable at a competitive rate in the market. The margins there are often quite squeezed in any event. So we need a combination of effort where the political environment and the financial services environment are working in tandem to create commercially attractive and competitive plays in the market that we can fund, which create sustainable outcomes. And right now, I hope it's not unpopular to say this, but I feel governments are very short, and we can call as much as we can to them from financial services plays to come to the party. But at the end of the day, we live and die by the market economy. And we can ask, but that's not really the responsibility of banks. That's the responsibility of governments. So I would say we probably are doing not enough. Let's do more. Let's shout from every hilltop. But it starts with government stepping in and creating the constraints for us to write business into.
Right. I guess the solution could be a little bit to say what is needed is a dialogue. Right, is a dialogue between the finance sector, the private sector, the regulators, in terms of we all want to get to net zero. It's in the parity. I mean, the governments have signed up to that, 10 years ago. Industry, the private sector, wants to be in alignment with that. They need the policies to be able to do that, but those policies need to be designed carefully so that they actually are conducive to the things that the private sector want, which is growth, which is risk, reduction, etc. The example that you provided, from the UK on real estate seemed to have ticked all of those boxes. And I'm just thinking that exercise, can the finance sector play a role in replicating it in other parts of the world, not the UK only? And it's happening, but to accelerate that and in other sectors. But all of this only works really for transitionable sectors. And we have untransitionable sectors. And I had a question for you on that, Maria. Again, not all sectors are transitionable, and we do have financial institutions with great exposures to those non-transitionable sectors. Certain forms of fossil fuels might belong to that. What can those FIs do? What do we tell them? What can they do? What should they do? What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that, of course, the transition of emissions will look different in different sectors. Different regions have different starting points, and I so much respect for those that are now transitioning from somewhere where it's actually going to be quite hard. I think that what we're seeing is a very healthy shift for the past 2 years, not only looking into the green, that's already sort of fit for a low carbon economy, but also how we're going to shift the parts that are harder to abate, where it might take some time, where we need more ideas, more innovation, also risk-sharing mechanisms in the financial sector, so that we understand that different parts can take different roles. And I think what Masaaki was highlighting is the sort of the growth of the transition finance element, where I think we've just only started. We see some very promising steps, because I think what we cannot be is to be afraid to touch those assets, because we need to double down on that. We need to have all the efforts into quite complex transitions in very complex systems, and how are we going to make sure that banks, asset owners, asset managers, insurance can all work together, state capital can work together to find those solutions, and that will be very regionally driven, I think. So we also need to look at the various countries' ambition to sort of develop their societies. How is the energy transition going to play into that country's plan for that country? And we see, that's how we can see as an export credit financer, that the buyers of maybe an energy plant or a hospital or new roads, they are looking into the development of the society. The energy transition is just a tool for that. So we need to also understand how that plays in.
Right. Thanks very much. And we are at time, we need to wrap up. I think what sunk in for me is we need to have a much more structured dialogue between finance, business, government on these pathways and what is needed and how they can be designed in a way that will actually be palatable and appealing and attractive to the private sector through risk and return type measures, and that it needs to be really nuanced. We almost need like a global matrix of countries and sectors, and then see, well, what's needed here and what's needed there, and how can we get this right? We need to, unfortunately, and we need to get this grand mobilization of FIs to be supportive of that. Hopefully, as UNEP FI, with our partners, with our members, we can play that role. We need to stop here, but this has been a very insightful discussion. I thank all my co-panelists, and I'm sure you all thank them too. Thank you very much.